Lyme's disease, communication, rebellion, and hitting someone with a car that tried to hurt you. All this and more right now.
The Remarkable People Podcast. Check it out. The Remarkable People Podcast. Listen, do, repeat. For life. The Remarkable People Podcast.
Hello, my remarkable friend. Welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. Whether you're a first-time listener or a long-time friend, we're thankful to have you here. Today's episode goes broad and deep. We cover crazy topics that we've never discussed on the podcast before, and then we get laser focused on areas of healing, physical and mental, emotional, and relational. So this episode is packed with nuggets that you can take and apply to your life. And it's from our guest today who has a remarkable story and journey. You're going to hear about how she got in a skating accident and almost lost her arm. She's going to talk about a man who attacked her. And then when she was getting away, he jumped on top of her car. So she did what she should have done and tossed him for a loop. And you're going to hear about how she had physical ailments while she was going to school to be a doctor. And then when she got out of school, when the illnesses continued, she finally learned how to heal herself. And now she's using her degree and firsthand experience to heal others through a balance of holistic and medicinal cures. So get your pen and paper ready for this episode. Just like all our episodes, all the knowledge in the world means nothing if you don't apply it. So take notes, apply what you need to for life, repeat it each day so you can have an amazing life in this world, but most importantly, eternity to come. When we're talking through this episode, there's clearly things that today's guest and I, maybe we would not do the same way. However, we understand each other, we communicate, and we have a great time in this episode, and it's a lot of fun. So again, enjoy the episode, reach out to myself and the guest, let us know how we can help you and take this information to the next level so you can just have a remarkable, amazing life. Hey, Dr. Diane, how are you today?
I'm good. So good to be here with you, David.
Oh, we are excited to have you. I know it's been a long wait. Actually, for your somehow, I think we spoke in January for the first time, and now we're recording in April. So sadly, but happily, that's faster than usual. So thank you for your patience and thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about our time.
Yes, yes. I just told our audience a little bit about you and what to expect in this episode. But whether someone is a serial friend and been with us for the 3 years, or if someone this is their first time, they know that this show is about growth and about listening to not only what you're able to achieve and overcome in life, but they're going to get the practical steps of how you did it so they can too. So if this interview had one truth that our listeners know, if they stick around between the beginning and the end, they're going to get a ton of gold nuggets. But this one truth, this one life lesson, this one mastery step, what is that going to be that Dr. Diane will help them with?
I'm going to make it rhyme because I think we remember things when they rhyme. So pleasure is a gift that makes your spirit lift. So we're going to talk throughout this about pleasure and everything that really is involved with living a more pleasure-filled life and why that's really important for your life, for your relationships, for your spiritual growth, on and on and on.
Awesome. Awesome. So everything that's happened in your life to today has made you the woman you are, the person you are. So let's start off in your birth. Where were you born? Mom, dad, married, broken family, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, good, the bad, and the ugly. How did your life start, Dr. Diane?
So my life started in a tiny town in Missouri. I am the oldest of 4 girls. So I was born to my parents. My parents are still together to this day. So they were married when I was born. I would say very kind of traditional upbringing initially. grew up with I'd like to say very like Dave Ramsey style values, like work hard, save money, put a lot of time into helping people in the world, these sorts of things. And I was in Missouri until I was 6 in a tiny little town that, before 6, I don't remember a ton other than there was a lot of trees behind my house. I remember going on these walks through what I thought was at the time this big forest, and turns out it was just a small backyard, and stuff like that. Remember these like spiral staircases my neighbors had that were so cool, but nothing, just kind of normal childhood stuff really up until 6. And at 6, my mom was pregnant with her 4th child. So we were pretty much every 2 years, me and my 3 sisters. And when she was pregnant with her 4th child, my sister Melinda, we then moved out to the Washington, D.C. area where the bulk of my time throughout childhood that's where I lived. So I'll pause to just make sure you don't have questions before I continue on.
Yeah, no. And at this point, your dad was in the house, like, no family is without any stress, but overall, there's no major trauma, nothing crazy, not even anything that like you'd feel is significant to share. And that is perfectly fine. Some people have like ideal childhood. Some people have nightmares. We just want to make sure we don't miss anything. So overall, everything's good to this point.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I have stuff that we'll get to, but the first part was very uneventful and that sort of thing. And
Yep.
yeah. And then beyond that, it was a very like normal, I would say wholesome, as people would describe it, Midwest type of upbringing. And even when I moved out to the East Coast and I started learning East Coast kind of things around walk fast, talk fast, move fast, all that, kind of East Coast stuff, still had that Midwestern type of, upbringing within my family unit. One of the things I would say kind of started happening and shifting in me early on was because my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and then my dad was the breadwinner for the company. And with my youngest sister being born, when there was then 4 of us, 0, 2, 4, and 6 years of age, I kind of had to step into this grown up role. And meaning like it was just a lot for my mom to take care of all 4 of us that were so young. So I remember when my littlest sister was born, I remember holding her, and I kind of became by no means I was a parent, I was 6, but I kind of became the person that my family leaned on. So I feel like at that age, I really started developing some characteristics around over helping in a way that was like not taking care of myself, which I'll get to in the later thread of my story, as well as the desire and the love for helping, which is also part of my path, as well as like not really learning how to take care of myself or to ask for what I need in life, and to really be able to assert like, hey, I have my own needs to help me be a well-functioning human being as well. Those were some of the things I feel like I took on based upon needing to step in this. I'm the helper. I'm the biggest sister, all these kids around, that sort of thing.
Okay. And then when you were in DC is an interesting area. So we have a lot of listeners outside of the United States, and even within the United States, some people don't understand DC. DC is a very interesting community. A lot of, not that you were or weren't, but a lot of politicians, a lot of international, a lot of companies and organizations. It's not technically a state, it's a District of Columbia, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes through DC. They have like good things and they have bad things, like the highest murder rate in the country all the time, and corruption, Congress. But what was your upbringing? Did you enjoy DC? Did you think this is a great place? Did you think these people are on crack? What did you think of DC?
I mean, growing up, I had, as far as like the typical things some people might think about DC, like you're mentioning, politicians and crime and various city types of things. I was largely sheltered from that throughout my childhood. It was kind of amazing growing up in a place where there was, a higher amount of culture and exposure to things in other areas in the States. So I appreciated that, but a lot of that I was largely sheltered from because I was put into Catholic schools my whole life, and my parents were very kind of tight knit with what they really wanted to expose us to. So I really didn't see a ton of that. I was very sheltered from that.
Okay, good. I just didn't know, because I'm not trying to be mean. There's some great people
Yeah.
in DC and there's some terrible people in DC, but
Yeah.
there's a polarizing effect of DC. It's either the elite or the poor typically. So
Yeah. And I did, that's when it started actually impacting me. And I don't want to jump around too much in our timeline here, but when I got to high school, I went to a very elite high school in the DC area called Bishop O'Connell. It's a great school, great education. Like I really feel like it set me up for a lot of success in my life. But one of the things that I found going to an elite school was like, I grew up in a family where like I felt like I had a lot of opportunity to come my way and that sort of thing. But my parents, like they scrimped and saved every dollar possible. We shopped at Walmart, we bought the $3.99 jeans, all these types of things, which I didn't realize was a problem until I went to high school. And even though we wore uniforms, like when we were in our non-school time, and everybody is wearing designer jeans with all these designer things, I remember it being that was a real big challenge to me at that age, with not understanding things like money and culture and, and values yet around what it takes to earn a dollar and how hard you have to work sometimes and that sort of thing. And I remember feeling like I got made fun of so much because of my clothes, because of being poor. So it really gave me this very different sort of mentality and confusion around money and finance and all that, because here I was in this family that was Dave Ramsey style, right? Bought everything cash and saved up. But then I was comparing myself. And I think one of the lessons that I've learned throughout my life is like, when is comparison actually good? And there's times, and when is comparison problematic? And one of the big problems with, comparison is we usually compare ourselves as humans to people that have more than us, right? And so that's a definition of unhappiness, versus if like, gratitude, the definition of happiness is comparing ourselves to like, if life could be worse.
mhm.
So it really put me in this situation where it was like, I was in my Walmart jeans. We didn't have like money for all the fancy things. We got one family trip a year. It was all like car trips and usually camping and things that were fun, but low cost. And so it really gave me a little bit of this confidence issue of like not being able to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak.
Yeah, and you were perfectly happy until you saw the alternative, and that's where the stress and conflict came in, correct?
Correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So I didn't mean to jump you around. It's just that is a very interesting area. It really is an exception of America, and even in the world, there's always exceptions, but you lived in an exception. That's why I wanted to kind of touch on it. So going back now, so between 6 and this point in high school, is there anything else we missed or skipped or leads into the future story of Dr. Diane?
Not a huge point. And a couple points to make. I mean, I had pretty normal stuff as far as like I was an athlete. I participated in a lot of sports. The one thing that actually was fairly impactful from childhood, and that does lead into some later points, is one of these things that I think happens so many times in childhood, right? Where the brain does not have the capacity to understand small little things that happen. And when the brain doesn't have the capacity to understand small little things that happens, it fills in the gaps by making stories. And sometimes these stories are true, oftentimes they're not. And so there was like a huge like impact to my confidence 2 different times that I would say. One in 5th grade. And this is like such a simple thing, but it really impacted like the story I put in my head, which was that it was like school yearbook time. And the teacher was handing out all the school yearbook pictures. And then all of a sudden she hands mine in front of the whole class. She's like, "These are really ugly." And so as a 5th grader, like then I just kind of put my I'm an ugly person hat on. And that really impacted my confidence, for many, many years, just from the story from that. And the other thing that I think is important is more than in high school from a standpoint of, kind of just being the underdog, which is I was on the basketball team and another woman did not really like that I was a starter and she played the same position as me. I think that's why, and also I was wearing Walmart clothes and she was not. That's the story that I've been able to understand around this. But I got bullied quite a bit in high school. And some of it was the Walmart thing, but some of it also, I think, was this particular woman. And And so I had a very small social group, and I felt a little bit socially isolated in that environment because I got made fun of, and just for like really simple things. Like I was lifting weights pretty heavily back then. And so I got a very short neck like men do when they overlift or when they really are, trying to achieve that. I didn't know how to lift correctly for my body as a woman. And so it's just like very simple things like getting made fun of, like for weird things kids do, like, okay, you have a short neck, right? So then everybody sit laughing at you and that sort of thing. So, minor things in the grand scheme of life, right? These are not like, it wasn't like I was living in poverty. I didn't have like traumas happening to me, but, so that was very fortunate, but just small little things that created stories in my life that kind of weave into, parts we'll get to later.
Yeah. And it sounds like your parents did a great job. They tried to give you everything they could and still keep that balance. But there's always those selective jerks that they actually have so much, but they're empty in the inside. So they take it on everybody else. I mean, sounds
Totally.
like, yeah, she's got her $150 Gap designer jeans, or what was the brand? Guess. Is that what it was
Yes.
when we were kids? Guess.
Yeah,
jeans?
that sounds about right.
The triangle.
Yeah. Oh, I
150
have the logo in my head. So they did a great job on their marketing.
Yeah, I was like you. I was poor. I couldn't afford those jeans. I was like, even if I had the money, I'm buying a TV. Forget a pair of jeans. I was like, all right. So you're in high school now, and you're working through the system, and there's pros and cons. There's normal stuff. There's a little more hateful stuff. Where does Dr. Diane go from there?
So this is when things start getting interesting. So 15, coming up on my 16th birthday, I have my first real boyfriend who I'm totally in love with. At least, I thought so at the time, and having a great time. And then I was a very observant kid. So all of a sudden I started noticing all of these envelopes, these manila envelopes come to my parents' house, and I noticed them and I noticed them, and I just felt like something was up. And so then my family is all out of the house one day. And so I did a little investigation and snooping around, and I found the envelopes like a good detective would. And it's now probably somewhere, I mean, my memory is not exactly perfect, but it's somewhere around May. My birthday, my 16th birthday is coming up in June. And I open all the envelopes, and it's basically my entire life laid out, meaning new school back in Kansas, now in Kansas, new home, title to the new home. There's a whole new life laid out for me. And that life starts in less than 2 months. So we moved the day after my 16th birthday, and it was a trauma to me, not just because of like high school and moving and those sorts of things, but when I confronted my parents about it later, I truly believe now, and we've repaired this, and I'll get to that later in the story, but I truly believe now that they were doing what they thought was best, which is like they wanted to make sure that we were 100%, everything was squared away before they told us, just in case something changed. But to me, as a 15, almost 16-year-old child, I felt like so abandoned and so deceived that they basically tore my life apart. They built me a new life. And not only did I not even get to say about it, they did this all behind my back and didn't tell me. So that was when I went from like very, very by the book, follow every rules, like Catholic, child, like do what mom and dad say. Mom and dad had my back. So basically kind of a big middle finger to the whole situation. And that really, that it was so impactful to me that it basically set me on a completely different trajectory for my entire life.
Yeah. And so you're 15, and that's like the age that girls, especially to their dads, they just tend to disconnect, go do their thing, and they come back in their early 20s and they love their dad again, right?
Yeah.
So now you have normal teenager, and then you have this extra disconnect. And when this is happening, you said you were the oldest of 4 daughters. So did your other sisters react the same, or were they more of like, oh no, we're good?
They were more good, but I think it was some of the fact that I found out, and the sister, once I found out, then my parents, of course, told my sisters. So there was some of that. There was some of the age. I was the only one in high school. So like they were in grade school. Some like my next sister down, Laura, she was like getting ready to enter high school. So she was going to change schools anyways. I was the only one with a boyfriend. They were younger than that. So I think there was just layers of how it was handled in particular, because it would have been intense, I think, moving cross country. You know, I like coming from DC, I started like hearing about, like, my friends started saying like, well, in Kansas, all they do is cow tip. And I'm like, well, what is cow tipping? You know? And I started reading, I'm like, people push over cows there? I don't want to push over cows. Turns out I have never cow tipped in my life, for a record. I've never seen anybody do it. That is not what we did in Kansas. But, you know, it was a trauma finding out about that way, because I had no idea like where I was going and what was happening. And I was being fed information like that.
Yeah, Kansas is a beautiful place. It's just like everywhere. It's pros and cons, but Kansas
Sure.
is a great state. But again, the popular, at least in America, you know, you think Kansas, you think like, oh, what's it called? The movie with the tornadoes, and you think all like, you know, tornadoes and
Yes.
Wizard of Oz. We're not
Yes,
in
yes, yes.
Kansas anymore, right? You just think,
Uh-huh.
outdoor farmers. It's not like that at all, right?
Yeah, not at all. Not
So,
at all.
okay. So now you're a teenager, you find out you're going. You said the day after your 16th birthday, you moved?
Day after the 16th birthday. Yeah, it was going to be the day before, but I talked my parents, luckily, into letting us stay in a hotel. So we stayed in a hotel because we had to be out of our house for a couple nights. And yeah, had dinner with my boyfriend at the time. On my 16th birthday, had my final dinner with him and said goodbye. And so he gave me a Swiss Army knife that I slept with in my hand under my pillow for probably 4 months afterwards.
Oh,
It's heartbreaking at that age.
yeah.
Love is heartbreaking at any age.
Yeah. Now, do you have children now? I know we're
I do
going to
not.
jump ahead. You do
I do
not.
not.
Okay.
Nope.
Okay. Because that's going to be okay. That was a question I was going to ask you. So let's go back. So now you're 16, you
Mhm.
moved to Kansas. And is this where your parents were originally from, or still a different region?
They're from Iowa, but they wanted to be, my dad got the ability to my dad requested a job transfer. It was also like very impactful back then, because there was this feeling of like, oh my gosh, you did this to me, you know, very victim type of feeling. And so he requested the job transfer because he wanted to be closer to my parents' family, which were both in Iowa.
Got you. So that makes total
Yeah.
sense. Okay. So
Yeah.
what you get to Kansas, and it's just like DC, right? Culture, everything is the same.
Oh yeah, totally. It's like practically no different. It even looks the same.
For our foreign listeners, that's total sarcasm. I'm joking.
Yes, it is. Thank you
Go,
for making that obvious.
go ahead. Yeah, because some people aren't watching either. They're just listening. So tell us about Kansas, Dr. Diane.
So it was interesting to get there because it just kind of continued the whole process for me of rebelling, which is basically one of the things that started in Kansas. So when I first got there, my parents had rented a car for us. I don't remember why we needed a rental car, but we needed a rental car for some reason. And they bring it home and they tell me it was my 16th birthday present, which obviously was not true since it was a rental. You know, they did it. They're funny, playful people, and they did it to be funny, but it obviously had, you know, an impact on top of everything else. And then I got grounded for something very, very stupid, of going to the fireworks, because July 4th was coming up and my cousin lived in Kansas. So he took me to the fireworks and I was in like the next suburb over that I was supposed to be in. And I didn't know, I'd been there for like 3 days, you know, so I didn't know where I was. So I got grounded and got in a lot of trouble. And so the point of sharing that was like, those were just like the initial land in Kansas was kind of my final straw with my family. Like, I just felt like, I mean, I had just completely washed my hands of them. I really just developed this feeling of like, these people don't care. They don't have my back. They're not looking out for my best interests. They can't even tell me the truth. They can't be honest with me. And now they basically punish me when I don't do anything wrong. So that's when I, you know, kind of said, I turned into like the bad girl, so to speak. And that was really born when, you know, when I got to Kansas.
All right. Well, take us down that journey. The good, the bad, the ugly.
So basically how that worked is, I did start playing, you know, sports and that sort of thing in Kansas, but then I really just stopped being involved in any of that. I still went to school and got, good grades and all of that. School is pretty easy for me. But that's when I started doing things like sneaking out, running around with boys, smoking cigarettes, drinking a lot. And that's really where I went through a period of time that started in high school of being extremely sexually promiscuous, which is a really important thing to lead to other topics and how I've gotten into parts of my career. But basically it was rebellious. It was even down to like things that I think some people like do in like modern day of coping and that are not healthy coping mechanisms, like cutting themselves. Well, I wasn't doing that, but I was piercing myself. So every time my parents would get mad at me for something, I would take a safety pin and I would basically put ice on my ears or my belly button or wherever I was doing, and I would put another hole in my body. So I pierced myself. I probably had 20 piercings that I did and then I had other piercings that I did professionally, but I had 20 or so that I had done all myself as like almost this strategy of coping. But this strategy, I think back then of like, I felt so out of my body and so out of my mind. And I felt such a lack of control over my life that there was some level of actually gaining control. So I would say that was kind of like the modern day, or the version back then of what people now would do in the cutting themselves world.
Yeah, that is something that's been done for years, but it's more, I think there's more of it today because there's
Yeah.
more people struggling. We have so much quote unquote knowledge, but people are blind to the answers and they're searching and they don't know what to do. So they just fill themselves with whatever comes. And that's sadly piercing, cutting, self-mutilation, tattooing. That's an addiction. It's
Yeah.
people, I don't care what people say. I don't know anybody that got a tattoo and then didn't like, the people when they're in rebellion, they go get a tattoo and they get another one, another one, another one. It's just addictive. And
Yeah.
that's how piercing was to you, right?
Oh yeah, there was definitely endorphins. Like I think some of it was feeling so much intensity in my body and so much lack of control and so much almost like rage. There was so much rage. I had so much rage back then. And I didn't know what to do with it. And it was really a way of coping, because once that I would pierce myself and the emotions like of rage, I would like calm down again. It would kind of get me back in my body, where it's like, okay, I can face the world again. And I think that's where these things can become addicting, is because they provide these endorphins, they provide these different things that allow us to really feel calmer for a second. It's not obviously a long-term effective strategy, because it's not really dealing with the core underlying things, but it was in that moment, it did provide this acute relief of the extreme rage I was feeling that I didn't really know how to talk about, because at this point I had also realized that emotions were just not something that my family had a lot of place for. Like, I was often told that emotional problems were, that I was too emotional, is the way it was said. Like, I was too emotional. So I didn't feel like even in expressing emotions that there was a safe way to do it. So this is sort of how I just managed it.
Yeah, no, totally understandable. And okay, so now where does life go from there? So you like you said, you're rebellious, you're a teenager, you're sexually active, you're piercing yourself, and you're not really sure and you're filled with rage. Where does it go from there?
Yeah. So the other thing I should mention, because this comes into play for another part of the story, I haven't mentioned it, is that at this point, I also was having a lot of digestive problems. They did start many years younger. They started in more like grade school, but they got really serious throughout high school, where I was having to take laxatives, not for abuse reasons, but for like, I could go 2 weeks without having a bowel movement and my stomach would hurt so bad and it would be so bloated and extended that I would look like I was a pregnant woman. Like, I could be multiple sizes bigger in my pants because of how bloated and distended I was. And and did some standard conventional workup and was just basically told this was how my body is and that there was nothing that could be done about it. And I just needed to accept the fact that, some people don't have many bowel movements in their life. So that was starting to impact me too. I know.
No, I'm not. That pisses me off so bad.
Me
Because when
too.
I was a kid, I was sick for so long. They told me nothing was wrong. It was in
Yeah.
my head, and it
Yeah.
was in my head. It was a tumor. And I just go back to, what do you call a doctor that graduates first in his class?
What do you, a doctor?
Doctor. What do you call
Yep.
a doctor that
Yep.
graduates last in his or her class?
Doctor. Yeah.
Exactly. And you unfortunately got the crappy one. So sorry. I really am sorry to hear that.
Yeah. 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 It was very, very unfortunate, but it really was like part of what led me to where I was today. So I didn't really know, when I graduated high school, I was raised in a very strict way of like, everybody goes to college. College is the answer. And I was fortunate enough to get a full academic scholarship to a state school in Southern Missouri. So I went there and I had no idea what to do. I started in social work because I knew I wanted to help people and that sort of thing. And one of my first teachers had showed us the financial numbers of social work and was like, you're not going to make money in this. And basically I realized very early on of like, I want to help people, but I want to do it in a way that I can also sustain, my life and like pay my bills and that sort of thing. So I didn't know what to do. So I ended up following kind of my father's advice, which was just go into business. I got a finance degree, and college was, it was mostly a large part of like the continuation of high school. It was a lot of partying. I really think though, one of the things I've thought back about the time in my life when I partied a lot that I think is important to mention is like, while I was definitely choosing, certain behaviors like smoking cigarettes and drinking ridiculous amounts of alcohol that were very not good for my health, there was an element of I would have these really unique experiences also involved in psychedelics and that sort of thing. And some of the experiences of using some of those substances, I actually think changed the way I looked at the world. And in some ways, I feel like they started shifting my consciousness in a way that just gave me a different way of looking at the world, even from a spiritual standpoint. So I do think there was actually some value that point in my life provided for me. But it was so my grandfather got real sick when I was about 21, and he was like a pack-a-day smoker, heavy drinker and all that. And so he ended up in the hospital and ended up dying a very, very painful death. And after seeing him in one of his like end of life days, that was kind of what snapped me out of that phase. And I gave up smoking like the day after I saw him. And then, and that kind of propelled me more into looking at health and nutrition and these sorts of things.
Okay. And then did you finish college by this point, or were you still in school?
I was still in school there at that point. The other thing to, I think, mention about the college experience was I was playing handball. I played handball we had a national collegiate handball team. So I was on the national team. And that was really fun. I was playing handball and I kept having these bursitis incidences. And the bursa, for those of you guys don't know, is a fluid-filled sac around your joints. And this fluid-filled sac kept swelling. It kept swelling and swelling and swelling. And so with that swelling, I ended up having surgery and have that operated on. And that is the first thing that I think was kind of a sign of some health problems that really started developing about 8 years later from that point. So that's an important thing to mention. But yeah, at that point I was still, just finishing school, kept my scholarship, stopped the partying around the time that Grandpa got real sick. And then from there, I did graduate with this degree of finance, and ended up getting my Series 6. So I could sell things like variable life insurance and those types of products. And so I started in sales and financial sales, which I failed miserably at. And it was not my passion at all. I was not good at it. Mostly I was not good at it because I was following people around in the industry I was working, where we would go into people's houses to talk to them about insurance and about their and retirement was like the bigger thing we were talking about with some of these variable plans. And I was just noticing that people were selling what was like the most important thing to them, right? So like what would make them the most money. So it was really more about like, how can I sell these people this product for their retirement that's supposed to be their life savings, not necessarily based upon what's going to be best for them, but what's going to make me the most money, right? So I was like really disenchantized by that really quickly. And it was a little bit of like, there was definitely some like boiler room stuff going on in that industry. For anybody that's seen that movie, it was its own version of Wild Times. And so I quickly realized it wasn't for me. I started reading more and more and more. At this point, my digestion's even worse. And I start reading more and more and more on nutrition, on other ways of doing things in the world. And that's when I got into my my very long path of what is now my current career.
Okay. And then talk about that. So you're seeking answers, you're seeing what you don't want to do, you're trying to find your place, you're having physical problems. So that becomes a distinct focus. You want to get better. So where does life go from there?
Yeah. And one of the things I think that's important to weave in here too is, it's like, just to take us back to this point that I said at the beginning, around pleasure. I want to continue to weave this in, because what was happening for me at this point is what was happening to me at various other points in my life around, okay, I have rage, I have anger. At this point, I'm frustrated with my job, with what I'm doing. And I definitely had this huge lack of pleasure and joy in my life. And at that point, I think with my upbringing, I would have said like, okay, well, pleasure is, there can be an element, right, where like hedonism was talked about, so much in, historical times. And like, there's a element where like pleasure, I think, can be looked at as even like, a little bit hedonic. And there's a lot more to pleasure than this. So this was a huge point when I just realized, another point in my life where I realized, okay, I'm not in pleasure. I am not having fun. I'm doing this work that feels like, not only is it not pleasurable, but it feels like it's not helping people. And so I ended up looking to become a dietitian, because that's really all I knew at that time. So I started going to school for dietetics, and I'm in this very boring, I would say, organic chemistry class, because that is my least favorite topic, I think, of all sciences. And my lab partner happens to be getting ready to start at naturopathic medical school. And I had never heard of naturopathic medicine in my whole life. But it turns out that basically what I was doing for my dietetics degree was actually all it lined up with the pre-med credits that I needed for naturopathic medical school. So I learned about this from this amazing woman, Paula, who's still a friend of mine today. And I got one of the last slots for the next semester. And within a few months, I was actually started in naturopathic medical school in Arizona.
Very nice. And then what year is this, if you don't mind me asking?
This is 2004.
Okay, 2004. Because I know in the 90s, it was really like taboo. And then as like time, just from the mid 90s to the mid 2000s, some people were still punks about it and arrogant and basically ignorant. And then some people were like, oh, maybe there is some truth to this. And some people were like, yeah, this has got good stuff here. So you were at that cutoff where it was starting to be accepted, but it fully wasn't mainstream, correct?
Yeah, 100%. And that's why it's like, this was another area where I don't think my parents knew what to do with me. I think they were trying to be supportive and everything, but it's like, looking online and just like reading a little bit is like, where like either this is like witchcraft, which of course is like very, very wrong when you have a Catholic upbringing. So it's either
it's
witchcraft.
Very wrong all the time, but yeah, I know what you're saying.
but especially when you have a Catholic upbringing.
Yeah.
So, it was either looked at as either witchcraft or something that was just like me throwing my life away and collecting all this debt and not having a way to pay for it, because it's just this woo-woo stuff that doesn't work. So, they were trying to protect me, I think, from making bad decisions, but at that time, I didn't feel like a ton of familial support. My family, I was still at a point where I was like not connected to my family. I was still very distant, wasn't coming home for family events and that sort of thing. So my relationship was not really repaired yet at that point in time. And I think adding this of like, okay, I'm going into this crazy woo-woo thing and throwing my life away really added a lot of taboo and a lot of challenge to my relationship with them. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's tough because, like you mentioned earlier, when our brain doesn't have all the facts, we just fill in the gaps, good or bad, right or wrong.
Right.
And you were a young girl. You were in a crazy time for everybody. If you have like the ideal situation, that's still a tough time for men and women.
Yeah.
And then your parents moved. You felt like it was a betrayal or a setup, and you had this deep, just like you said, rebellion that came out of it from the anger and the rage. So it's like just simple conversations, looking back and working through things, or better communication could have changed so much, but yet everything happens for a reason. So now you're here and you find your way to naturopathic medicine. You go to school for it. And then where does your life go from there, Dr. Diane?
So Arizona was very interesting for me. So Arizona, I met some really great friends. I had a great community. I ended up, from more of like the education standpoint, I decided I wanted to add on a second degree. I decided I wanted to do acupuncture and oriental medicine. And I was not a big fan of the school down there for that. It was a different school. So I only did 2 years there before I actually transferred up to Oregon. But, that was like, there's a few things to take home from Arizona. Like, one was still me kind of exploring my own everything, trying to figure out who I was in the world. I started turning like my whole personality. I turned like very punk rock. So I was still kind of in like the piercing stage and all that. So I kind of took a turn of, punk rock kind of turn with everything I was choosing in my life, including dating this very, very kind man that had a very, wonderful blue mohawk and, kind of shocked, I think, the heck out of my parents. But the important thing about that is to tie back into the pleasure and where I'm going longer term than that is I tried a very interesting relationship style. I tried a triad, which was me and a woman and a man all in a relationship together. And so one of the things I learned about that, and I'm going to speak about that later on when we get to my previous marriage, because it all ties together. But one of the things I really learned about that is like, I learned about, say, challenges and strengths of different types of setups, of different ways we connect and different ways we interrelate. And the way I described that type of relationship was like, when things were good, it was like magnified. When things were bad, it was magnified. So that was a very, very interesting time period that I took a lot away from around relationships and that sort of thing. And then the other important thing probably here is like, and I don't know exactly what inspired this, but I just started getting a voice back. This is when I started meditating. This is when I felt like a different part of like my own spirituality really opened up. The way that I connect to spirit and God and consciousness really shifted around this time. And I spent a lot of time meditating. I spent a lot of time, really starting to process old wounds. The desert, like sometimes people say, people go to the desert to heal. And I definitely think the desert provided some of that for me. I started doing a lot of fasting. I did a 10-day water fast when I was down there. I would do a lot of juice cleanses. I turned vegan, raw food, and did that for a year down there. So I really just started exploring as I was kind of leaving this like super party stage of my life. I really started exploring like these other ways of healing that were a lot healthier. Like, okay. And some of these things I also think I took too far, as far as like the intensity that I was approaching health and fasting and some of these types of things. But it did actually create, like through a 10-day water fast, like that creates some pretty altered states, and it really created like different states where I felt like I was almost able to tap into subconscious beliefs and stories and things from my childhood around confidence and around some of the things that I've talked about. It was really once I started down this road of like healing and meditating and this different way of approaching my spiritual journey. That's what really helped with starting to change some of those programs from my childhood and that sort of thing. And subsequently, I think due to all of that, that's actually when I, called my parents and we started having heart to hearts about like childhood and some of these stories I talked about where I could, hear their side of things and hear their perspectives and they could hear mine. And that's where some of the, familial type of repair on my relationship started happening as well.
And during this time also with all the experimentation and all the things you're doing differently, did your health and your gastric bypass, your gastric issues start resolving? Did you find relief yet from that?
No. In fact, they got worse. They actually got worse. And some of it, I think, is due to the microorganisms that I later found in my gut and this high fiber type of diet I was doing. While some people do really great on that, it was actually the wrong thing for my condition. So it was actually feeding the dysbiosis, the imbalance, and the bacteria in my intestinal tract and making things worse, which was ultimately part of the reason why I got off of that diet. Was I did think that part was actually, getting worse.
And I want to say something, but I don't want to say it offensively. Your parents said you're being too emotional when you were a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, you were kind of in rebellion through your years and you're just getting out of it at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And we know now that there's such a deep connection between the gut and the brain.
Sure.
And there's people who have truly been sick in their gut and they were put in mental institutions. They got that fixed and they're perfectly healthy. It was nothing mental. So do you think a lot of, and we're going to get to it, but do you think a lot of your historic emotional and mental challenge? No, that sounds horrible. It's not like there's anything wrong with you, but I'm saying what you experienced that you described in this episode, do you feel like a lot of that had to do with your gut? Gave you like a lack of balance?
I think there was a element that had to do with my gut. I do know that, I do believe in like medicine and the work I do, that there's pretty much always both a physical and a mental emotional component of health problems for everybody. Some people it might be like 10%, mental emotional, 90% physical. Other times it's vice versa. Yeah. But there's like, we can't separate the mind and the body. They're so interrelated. And I do know even in my adulthood, with all of my good health practices and with feeling in my 40s way better than I did in my 20s, I do know that like the moment I get, overstressed or I don't take care of myself, or I feel emotions around something, the first place it goes to in my physical body is nausea. I could get nauseous. So I know like I do have a tendency with how I'm wired for emotions to manifest in my digestive tract. So I do feel like there was a relationship, but I definitely feel with everything I found that it really was only a piece of the puzzle, but there was a lot of other pieces of the puzzle that were related to it.
Okay. Yeah. So now you're in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
You moved to Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
Do any of your, like you said, you're in a relationship, a triad, did they move with you or did they stay back?
They stayed back, and I ended that even before I moved, just because it was starting to feel, it was just complicated. And there was
I've never seen that work out personally, but I'm just saying, I'm being honest.
No, and I'll bring up more when I talk about my marriage, because there's another thing to add to that. I've seen.
I'm not making fun of you or saying anything negative. I'm just saying personally, the people.
Yeah.
Right, keep going.
Thank you. I don't feel like I'm being made fun of at all. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I don't mean that at all. Sometimes though I speak before I think, so.
Yeah, me too. So no, they did not come with me. And I basically decided at that point in time, I was never going to do a relationship like that again, because it just felt so emotionally taxing. It just felt really, really emotionally hard. So I discovered that for me, that it was a very difficult, relationship and that sort of thing. And so when I moved to Oregon, I met I moved with almost like $0, right? So I sold everything I owned.
A college student with $0? Come on.
Yeah, it's weird, right? I had a life insurance policy that my grandfather had taken me out on as a baby that was worth $1,000. So I cashed that in, which now I kind of regret. But back then I needed $1,000. So basically I packed everything up in the car. And this is like crazy to me to think about now. I moved to Oregon with my car. I had no place to live. I couldn't even I had to drive straight. I took a couple naps in parking lots, on the way, but I couldn't afford a hotel because I had $1,000 and I had to basically find a place to live and pay, deposit and first month's rent and live for I think it was about 3 weeks or so before my first student loan would come in for my new semester. So I moved up. My friend Paula, the one that kind of told me about naturopathic medicine, she lived up there. So I stayed with her for a few days while I looked around on Craigslist for roommates.
And
Found
by the
this,
way, was this Northern Oregon, Southern Oregon? What part?
Portland.
Okay, Portland. So Northern Oregon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically I found roommates on Craigslist, found this cute little house in the center heart of Portland, and 3 roommates. Move in with them. The money thing all works. Got that covered. And the first day when I'm being interviewed for a place to live there, I wind up meeting the person that opens the door. Is a very sweet man. And it was one of those situations, where I don't know if you've ever had this happen. I imagine you ever had this happen where you just meet somebody and you're like, I know you. There's just it just felt like ancient history. I'd never seen this man before in my life, but it was just like I knew him.
Yeah.
So
No, I think many of us have had that happen.
yeah. So that was this guy, wonderful man. I ended up falling in love with him. I used to do this thing where I would joke with my friends that were how people would if they're thinking about a man and they're oh, maybe I'll just do this thing that's kind of stalkerish, but I know people that do this where it's I'm going to drive by his house or drive by the woman's house and see if they're home. So I lived with him and he lived in the basement and I lived on the first floor. It was a 3-floor place. And so I would sometimes walk to the kitchen where I could see his door and see if the light was on. So I used to call it the walk by, is he home? That sort of thing. But anyways, I fell in love with him, and that led to its own kind of story. But really there, what I think I learned the most out of Portland and out of that relationship, with him, one of my themes throughout all of this has been being a helper, right? And so that started kind of with a childhood. And I've had a tendency in my life, a pattern that I believe I have now broken, of basically over helping and helping to a point where it's I will help people sometimes that don't want to help themselves, and do so much and put in so many hours and sacrifice my own sleep and my own self-care. And so that was a pattern I had for a long time. And, in this particular partner turned out to be another example of it. We had an amazing relationship. He taught me to snowboard. He taught me to kiteboard. He was so much fun. We could talk all hours of the night, and he ended up asking me to marry him. But in the middle of this process of all of this, I discovered that he had started using opiates and had kind of gotten addicted to opiates in a really severe way. And once we had gotten engaged, I wound up ending the whole process with that, because I felt like it was, the addiction was so bad and it was creating so many problems. And I tried to help him and scary nights, nights of calling hospitals and nights of calling the cops and nights of he hasn't come home. Is he in the gutter? And so I ended that relationship, and not shortly after that, he did wind up passing away. And so that was a very, just a lot of emotions, there was just a lot of emotions during that time period. So yeah, questions on that. I'm going to pause.
No, that's
that one
hard.
feels emotional for me.
That's hard. And I think if anybody's listening and you love somebody deeply, you want to put everything you can and you'll die to help them. But, there's a core principle in counseling that says you can't put in more effort than the person themselves.
Yeah.
So if you're not seeing reciprocation and people, saying yes, and then actually doing something to help themselves, doesn't matter how much effort you put in, it's not going to work. So I'm really sorry to hear about your loss. That sucks. And then
Yeah.
was it kind
Yeah.
of like what did his just
Accident.
get worse and worse and worse and it just
Yeah.
overdosed?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, that's what I think. I mean, we had separated at that point, so I never got the final report from the family. They wanted to keep it very private as far as what happened. So I think that was possibly what happened there. I'm not really totally sure on that because I didn't get the final report, but yeah, it was a very, very sad time of life. And I think the bigger, one of the biggest lessons is exactly what you said around like this thing that really took me a long time to get around, like, it's really hard, especially being like, for anybody that knows the Enneagram, I believe I'm an Enneagram type 2, the helper. And so, my tendency has been in life to overhelp and overgive and overhelp and overgive, and until a point where it's like I can't do that anymore. And really, really sweet man. It's really sad he's not with us anymore, as he just had an amazing soul. And it was just somebody that I think with, like, the current opioid epidemic that we really have, and, the fentanyl crisis and all these things going on in the world regarding opiates. I really think it was just like another example of somebody that is like, just got lost in that world, and couldn't get out. So that was a really, really intense part of being in Oregon. And then in Oregon, I loved my school there. I was excelling in school. I had great mentors, some of who I'm still in contact with today. So I ended up finishing my naturopathic doctorate, and I got my master's in acupuncture and oriental medicine there. I got another doctorate later on. But what really happened in Oregon was like, that was when my health started really taking a turn for the worse. And some of that was happening like during my engagement, but a lot of it worsened soon after. So I think it was one of those things where, like, the emotions of dealing with all that, like, I already had all of this like worsening of things, which I'll talk about here in a moment, but then the emotions of then having the stress of that really put me over the edge. And that's when I started having
And
like
just going
memory
to
loss.
school, and probably you had to work. I mean, you're probably juggling 18 things at that point in life, and it makes any issue worse. It's like
Yeah.
adding fuel to the fire, correct?
Yeah, 100%. Some people might think that, like, oh, naturopathic medical school, like, okay, well, that's like probably healthier than like conventional medicine school. It's actually so similar. Like, our coursework looks like for the first 2 years is almost identical. It's the course load is very similar. The amount of hours are very similar. It's in the library till 3 a.m. with a triple shot of espresso, falling asleep on your books, and
Yeah.
it looked like that for years.
Yeah, I know
So
a guy who went to medical school, and same
yeah,
thing. It's just like a fire hose to your brain nonstop. And
yeah,
his arm literally stopped working for 9 months.
yeah,
It just stopped working.
yeah.
And as soon as he graduated, it was a senior year. It was like the next day it just came back, and he never had a problem again. It was just
Well,
so much pressure, his brain shut that off.
and it's exactly right. And that's exactly why, like, when I started having some of these symptoms that I'm describing, it, like most people, when I saw even some of my mentors, is like, this is just medical school syndrome. It's going to go away. Right. So
Yeah, that's
initially,
it. Medical school syndrome.
right. It's like, there's like practically a diagnosis. Right. So I started having like these episodes where something would come over me, and like, I would forget like basic things like where I lived. Right. So it was like, I was remembering things like, okay, well, if I studied all night with my textbook, I could go and I could get good grades on my test. But then I would like do something like, I'd leave the house and I'd walk a block, and it was almost like this cloud would come over, and it was like very disorienting. It was like kind of like remembering some of my psychedelic experiences from my my late teens, early 20s. It almost felt like that, but there was like, I was very sober. There was none of that. I was just like having these symptoms, and I would forget where I lived, and everything would get disoriented, and there would be this weird, like the world, like my vision would get weird, and everything it was just crazy. And then kind of like your friend with his arm, like I was starting to have these like sensations. It was sometimes it would be numb, sometimes it would be just like tingling, but I would have these episodes where all of a sudden I'm like, I'd be driving and I'd be like, I can't, like, I can make my arms work, but I couldn't feel the steering wheel. So then in those situations, it was like, okay, get to the side of the road as fast as possible, because all of these things were like fleeting. And so then like that would go away, and then like, okay, everything's working again. Like I'm fine. But it was just like really, really scary things like that. And pain so bad. I started getting these pain episodes in my body that felt like my legs were being sawed off. There was a couple of times that I actually got stuck on a toilet, like literally stuck on a toilet, which is like of all places to get stuck, that is not the preferred place. But because the pain was so bad that like that motion of actually trying to stand up, I couldn't do it. I was stuck. It was crazy. Nights lying in bed where I would get stuck and I needed to use the restroom, and I would be up all night. Luckily, I would just hold it. I don't know if I should have just gone for it, but like I was like needed to use the bathroom so bad, and I couldn't get up to actually get to the bathroom. And so I would just lay there until somebody else was awake and I could, get help. And so really, really just like crazy things like that. So Oregon, so like where I feel like Arizona was almost this place of like, okay, this new part of spiritual awakening and like looking at the world and healing past things. Then it's almost like Portland. It was like I built like the most amazing community. I still have so many friends there to this day. So my community there was really, really strong. But it was then like everything from a physical standpoint, where Arizona was a lot of emotions, and everything from a physical standpoint that had not been really, say, healed, that really came to light there. And my body just started breaking down. My parents, and it was like amazing. Like, ever since we healed our relationship, we've just had an amazing support system with them. And I called my mom probably almost daily, just like crying because I didn't know what was happening. There was a time period where I thought I must be dying. I was like starting to like research deserted islands to be like, okay, should I just like find a hut where I can live on 25 cents a day and just like wait until I die? Because I had no idea what was happening. But somehow in the middle of all that, I did manage to get great grades, to complete. It was like my brain was working in some ways, but it would just like shut down in these other ways.
Yeah. And then let's go back to this. So you mentioned you did resolve and heal the relationship with your parents. So
Mm-hmm.
many people have a bad relationship with their parents right now. So
Yeah.
if you were to break down the steps, like we heard your story, but
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
practical steps of opening up dialogue, working through the issues, what are some things you'd give to our listeners to say, hey, if you're struggling, here's some things you may want to try?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things I did that I would recommend, it's kind of in relationship to what you were saying around like, okay, well, if you're trying to help somebody and like they have to be ready, right? You can't just like counsel somebody who's not ready to make the change. So one of the first, and that first call that I remember having with them where we started this initial conversation, I started by just asking permission to have the conversation, and actually asking and saying, hey, there's some stuff that that happened in my childhood that I know that we have different opinions on. I know there's a lot of hurt, and I know I hurt you and you hurt me. And I would really just like to have a conversation around, hearing your perspective and getting my perspective heard. And, just wondering if we can actually have that kind of conversation. So it was one of the things, and that's where I would recommend people consider starting. And I think every situation is different. But with these kind of conversations, I find that if we can ask permission and then also allow somebody the opportunity, if they're having an emotional day and it's not a good time for them and they don't feel like they're worked out, because if they're not resolved themselves and they're going to immediately go into anger and all these things, it's probably not time for that conversation. So it allows them an out without drudging up these old feelings if they're not ready. So that would be, I'd say, first step.
Yeah, I think that's a great first step. Definitely. And then what would you say for the next step?
The next step is ask questions, is starting by ask questions around like, okay, like with me, It's like, hey, I would like to hear about you. And, my mom, hey, I'd like to hear about how that was for you, that incident from my childhood. What was going on for you, and what was going on in your life with why you made that decision? And then just listen. And I think this is the hardest part, right? Because when we go into these conversations, at least for me, it's so easy around like, but I want to talk and I want the healing for me, right? But if we're the one initiating that, it's, if you can come at this with a point of like, okay, my whole job here is to listen, and listen to understand, not listening like the way that I think so many of us do as humans. And it's so easy. And I think we all have tendencies that I still work to improve this in myself, but listen to understand instead of listening for the next thing to say. And so some of what helps me with that in these types of conversations is to have a notepad. And instead of like blurting out any buts or anything, but and my feelings or whatever, actually write them down. Because that way it's like, because sometimes I think we can say like, if we're like, hearing like, oh, somebody else's experience in this, and it's so easy then for us to be like, okay, well, I want to jump in with this thing because I don't want to forget to say it. And that's not the truth for me. And that's very different than my feeling. And we don't want to lose it. But if you can write it down just so you can track, even like, okay, another thing that somebody said here, and this is where I want to respond, that can help. And then, I think the work that's, oh my gosh, I'm totally forgetting his name right now. The nonviolent communication guy. That work at all?
Wait,
no, but that's a great example. I'm blanking the guy that coined that term.
Oh, Stuart Smalley?
No.
We could do this all day.
I have one of his books on my bookshelf somewhere. But basically, nonviolent communication is a very, very well done method. And you can look it up and find the man's name that I'm blanking on. He does a really great work with like helping people. There's tons of books on the concept of using feeling words. And it's a whole system, right? So that's his system to teach, not mine. But one of the concepts that I really got out of his work that have used a lot in these situations is really to use feeling words when they're feeling words. So like, for example, a lot of us use feeling words when we're talking about stories. So it feels like you never listen and you don't care is like a very different, that's not really a feeling. The feeling is I'm feeling uncared for. So it's like when we differentiate, hey, how we're using these tiny little words and we just talk about feelings, it almost takes some of the responsibility off the other person, but helps them understand the impact.
Yeah,
and
I think that's a good illustration.
You know what I mean? So the idea of this is like, listening really to understand, because most of the time, it's like, yes, there's some humans that really do bad things. And there's some people that really are broken in their relationships and their communication. And some relationships, people are just truly not at a place where they're able to heal them. And there's also, I think, a lot of people that when they communicate and when they make decisions and do things that hurt other people, oftentimes it's coming from their own lens of their own broken childhood or their own stories or their own lack of self-confidence. And so sometimes when we start to listen to understand why they did something, that allows for a better communication around, okay, well, they did this, not saying it's excusing it. And that's what we want to really differentiate. Like it doesn't really excuse it, but to help come from a place of like understanding. When people feel understood, they most of the time when somebody feels understood, their nervous system calms. And then it's a lot easier for them to go into, okay, now I'm ready to understand. Yeah. And so, a lot of it that, I really have done over the years as I've practiced, more and more communication and still, have times where I don't do it perfectly and learn and get better and better, really comes down to, these types of things around like, okay, trying to understand somebody and understand where they come from. And then once that's like repeating back to them, like, okay, so mom, in my example, like, you did this because you're actually trying to protect me. You didn't want to bring me through this emotional thing when you thought that it might not actually happen. You didn't want to drag me through that emotionally. Is that right? Making sure they feel understood. And then again, asking questions. Can I share with you the impact it had on me now? Right.
Yeah.
And so again, it's like, then when I'm launching into like, okay, well, this is how I felt, felt abandoned, felt confused, felt all these different things. When I launch into that, I'm launching it from a place of like, I'm not barfing on them. I've actually asked their permission to say, oh, I've asked your permission to see, like, are you able to be in a place to hear me? And you might find, I mean, the thing of like using techniques like this, I have found is like, sometimes the answer to that question might be no, I won't hear you. And in that situation, like that relationship's not going to be healed, but at least you're not going to go through that whole thing around like trying to explain this and then having another set of like rage or anger or whatever else. It at least protects you a little bit from trying to get something and realizing, and really kind of takes the pressure off one to be like, oh, this is actually this other person is not at a place where they're able to hear and receive this.
Yeah. And 15-year-old Diane listening to her mom and dad tell them the story of why they're doing what they're doing is a totally different conversation than 25-year-old Diane, and then
Totally.
35-year-old Diane, 45, because the older we get,
Totally.
the more we can see it through their filter. And at that point, they could say, our daughters are, they're enjoying life. We don't want to upset them till we know this is for sure. So we're just not going to say anything till we know it's for sure. And then we're going to let them know. I mean, as a father, I can see that reasoning completely. But as a son and as you're the daughter, I can see it's like, what the hell? Why didn't you tell me?
Yeah.
So it's like you can see it both ways. So, all right. So now you're finishing up school in Oregon. Your fiance dies. You're having physical illness. Where does your life go between there and today?
So I was given a great opportunity, a job offer from one of my mentors out there that I really wanted to take so badly. But it was one of those intuitive type of gut feeling types of things where everything told me to move to Colorado. Like it was just, I just felt so strongly like that was where I was supposed to go. So packed up again, moved. Dad helped me move this time. Much better experience than moving to Arizona. And got to Colorado. Moved in with one of my friends from Arizona who had ended up in Colorado. So had a place to move into and started building my business just by building my website and, doing everything from scratch and from hand.
And again, what part of Colorado? Just
that was in Boulder, Colorado.
Oh, I lived there for a few months. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I moved to Boulder, Colorado.
Pearl Street, right?
That's right.
All right, go on.
That's the happening street. So moved there and very quickly, must have been like a week, 2 weeks, very, very soon. It was like within that first month of moving there, I decided to go roller skating. And this is still at a point where my health's not very, very great and I'm still having problems. And I was trying though, I've always, since my childhood, I've always been an athlete. So I would still try to like get movement. So I went roller skating and I started going down the hills of Boulder and I had a very, very bad crash and shattered my arm into a million pieces. And when I got into the hospital in the surgery room, the surgeon looked at me and said, I'm not sure if I can fix your arm. I think we might need to amputate it. And so that was obviously very, very, very big deal. And it was very interesting. And even just thinking about like the power of the mind. And I have a high belief that I had a very, very, very well-skilled surgeon because he did put my arm completely back together. And I have just other than a few degrees range of motion loss, which nobody can even notice, and a slight deficit in tricep extensions at the gym. There's like basically no other long-term problems with it. But I remember there, being there on, in under like the pain medicine they have you on when you're getting ready to go into surgery and you have so much trauma like that. And the surgeon's telling me he's not sure. He might wind up having to amputate during surgery. And so I remember that conversation, and I looked at him, and it was like so interesting looking back, like the amount of like conviction and belief, where it's like, it'd be so easy for me to drop into fear right there. But I looked at him, and I looked him in the eyes, and I remember feeling this with every cell in my entire being. And I looked at the surgeon, and I was like, there's no way that's happening. I know you're going to fix my arm. And it was just like, in going into surgery, it's like I said, I know he was an amazing surgeon. Like, it was one of those things in physical therapy where they put my x-ray up on the wall, and then like the whole team would get called in around like, hey, you got to see this. I have tons of hardware and metal in my arm now holding me back together. But I also feel like there was an element with that was really based upon going into that situation with so much conviction, so much belief, on a cellular level, that I was going to come out of that, and I was, going to be well. So that I got out of it, and I continued to build my business on the couch, with my arm healing, now building my website with one hand, luckily my right hand, which I'm right-handed. So, so there was all of that. And then see, from there, that's when I also started realizing that I was more sick. And because I was starting to talk to my friends, and my friends were graduating, or they had graduated, and they were starting to feel better and better and better. And so they were sharing with me like, like medical skin syndrome's over. Like we're doing so much better. And I was getting worse. And that's when I realized, I started running lab tests on myself. And that's when I realized that I had Lyme disease. I had, about a dozen other hidden infections. I had mold built up in my body. I had toxic metals. I had a lot of other types of disease processes in my body built up. And so that's really what began my, my own personal journey back into wellness. And, in part of my medical practice, I have two different parts of my medical practice, but the one part of it that I do is really based upon Lyme and mold and chronic fatigue and some of these hidden long-term diseases. And, my book is called It's Not in Your Mind, kind of based upon this thing around like, like it was in my mind, or it was just medical school syndrome. And so many people, I think, with these long-term chronic things really end up like with some sort of disease processes like this. And it's just about believing in your gut, knowing that it's not in your mind, and working over and over and over again, just being a self-advocate, so that if you're told it's in your mind, if it's in your mind, it's going to be something like you're talking about, where it's like actually a tumor or something like that in your brain, right? Like, but as far as like making it up, like that's what most of us, think of when, like when we're told it's in our mind, it's like, oh, you're just, you're making this up. Like 99.99% of the time, that is not what's happening. Like maybe there's a small percentage of the time where that could be it, but I've certainly never seen it. Like anytime somebody's come to my, my practice with, being told that for years, there's always a reason. It's just about knowing the right test and figuring out why that inflammation and why those imbalances are occurring.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I was personally interviewed this morning for another podcast, and we had this discussion in depth. And there's just so many aspects to it, because very few people are actually hypochondriacs and people who are making it up. And you can usually tell those people, they have other things going on, right?
Yeah.
Nobody
exactly.
who's like, I want to go on, I want to live, I want to be free. Those aren't the people. Now, there are illnesses that are caused by pain and hurt and trauma, and then they sit in our body, and we got to work through the emotion to let the physical free. So that just God made this beautiful body in balance, and we just need to clear it and flush it. And like you said, sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's mental, sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's spiritual, but they all intertwine.
Yeah,
It's all connected.
absolutely.
So now you are growing your practice in Boulder. You break your arm roller skating, you said, right? You break your arm roller skating so bad, you almost had to have an amputation, which is serious. You're in pain. You're seeing your friends get better. And now you're really thinking something's wrong. You're running tests. You're like, wow, I have a lot of things wrong. So now I'm sure there's fear and there's scared. There's probably some relief, like, okay, I'm getting answers, but now what do I do? Because even if you know you have some of these illnesses, it's like, how do you cure them? Or sometimes worse, people say they're not curable. So where does your life go from there, Dr. Diane?
Yeah, I mean, there's the lucky thing for me about going through some of this, like the blessed thing for me, and that was like the fact that I had gone to naturopathic medical school and I like had learned how to read research studies and I had learned all of this stuff. So there's definitely where I do, like, I agree with what you're saying. Like for a lot of people, it's like you have this many disease labels thrown at you, you can be like, oh my gosh, it can feel like I'm so broken. And there can be a lot of distress around that. But because of my background and I'm a scientist at heart. So because of all of that, when that happened, for me, it was a lot more curiosity, right? For me, it was a lot of curiosity around like, okay, well, how do we fix this? Some of the stuff that came up were things that I was well trained on in school. So it was like, okay, I know what to do. Other things like Lyme disease, we touched on in school, but it wasn't like it by any means very much of our training. So that led to a lot of studying. It led to a lot of online courses. It led to me calling doctors around the country that I could actually study with and shadow. So it really led me to explore and to learn about, disease processes like this in a way that it was just like urgent, right? So I got thrown into the research and that sort of thing very, very quickly as I traveled and I did some of that. And so things started getting better, And then I met this man who also turned out to be just like, these patterns that I think that oftentimes we do as humans. And it's like one of the things that I think is really important to explore that I hope people are also getting on this. Of I'm like, okay, our patterns and cycles, and why do we choose in some ways so many similar things? So for like me, I ended up in another relationship where I moved out of Boulder. I moved into the city of Denver with this man, and it started out really great. And this was very quickly. This was all very quickly after I had moved here. So I'm still in the middle of this. And I call this year, the other thing to say is I call this year my rice and beans year, because that's what I was living on, because I had basically $0. I was trying to build my practice when nobody knew who I was. I had, with the school I went to and having 2 doctorate degrees and a master's, there's a lot of debt. I like to joke, I have a house in my brain. It was over $500,000 of student loan debt. And so then I started having debt collectors call me because I can't pay on any of this. And from day to day, I could have literally a dozen different collectors because I had started using credit cards throughout this process to get things up and going with business. And so anyway, so it was very, very scary. It was like some days I did not know if my lights were going to get turned off, all these sorts of things. And then this man that I moved in with, after like me being like already financially strapped and so everything's so tight. Like, I was going to the store and like looking at 2 products and being like, well, that one costs 3 cents less, so I have to choose that one, like micromanaging down to the penny.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when my partner at the time lost his job and decided that he didn't want to get another one, and I couldn't
That's
kick
a
him
big
out
problem.
yeah, his name was on the lease and I couldn't kick him out. And so then I was like, kind of supporting both of us. That obviously, and like in the middle of all this, I'm trying to heal my health. So it was just this very like sheer will. But that's actually something that I think medical school really trained me in, for mostly better, sometimes for worse, is the ability to just like push and persevere through anything. Because it's like when you have 11 tests in 1 week, and it's like, and you're exhausted and you're staying up all night with coffee, and it's like all that the body wants is sleep. And basically training the body that it's like, you want this, but you can survive this. You want this, but you're going to make it through. And so I think I did so much training of my body. And that was like one of the hidden gifts of medical school that I think a lot of people don't talk about, is that ability to push and persevere and to have a will. It just developed my will to survive in a way that I don't know if I would have made it through the post-medical school stuff. It wasn't for medical school, and how that really developed me as a individual. And so the thing that I like to share about this particular partner that I think is important, because it has provided a lot of understanding of humans in a certain way, is there was some abuse that started happening. And there was physical abuse. And the final night of it was, I was against the wall and he had me against the wall by my throat. And so I was like pinned against the wall by my throat. And in this moment, I was basically kind of going over in my head, like, where are my keys? Where's this? Where's that? Like, where's my car? Like, okay, car's parked here, keys are here. Here's where that sort of thing, just like my escape plan. And then I don't even remember what I said, but I said something that made him let me go. And I ran out of the house and grabbed my keys, grabbed in the car, was driving away. At one point, he like jumps on the hood and is like staring. It was like out of some sort of movie. I'm driving, and on the other side of the window is him like holding on, staring
I'm
at
not
me.
laughing at your situation, but I'm laughing at the situation. Because it's
Yeah,
like,
it's like out of a movie, right?
yeah, that's right.
Like,
I'm picturing that. Yes.
So I'm being descriptive because it's like, I look back, I'm like, how is this real?
See, as a dad, I'm like, hit the gas, go really fast, then hit the brakes. And then
that's actually basically what I did, but a little bit more gently than probably my dad would have said. But that is basically what I wound up doing. And then I drove around a little bit further down, where I was like far enough away, looked in the rearview mirror, made sure he got up, I would have called 911, that sort of thing if he didn't, but he like got up. I could see that he was up and walking and all that, drove away. And that was the end of that relationship. But what it taught me though, was like, I stayed in it way too long. And what it taught me is like, looking back at some of the psychological like manipulation that was going on in my head, and the things that he would say to me to, in some ways, like start making me question like my own sanity and like what I was actually seeing in the situation. I just had a different understanding for why people stay in bad relationships and how much psychological manipulation there is. And sometimes it's like, well, why do people go back to these, to these things that are so bad? It's like, oh, there's so much psychological manipulation that happens. So it really developed, I feel like, a different aspect of compassion for people when when they go back to situations that are not healthy, and really understand that. And then also connect it to this, thread of like pleasure and libido that I'm going to start tying in here a little bit more, is really started alerting me to this thing around like safety and libido. And, and I think this happens bidirectionally for men and women, but I think it's even a bigger thing for women, as just naturally, most of us tend to, without as much testosterone, be a physically weaker gender. And because of that, there's like this huge thing that that comes up for women and libido around like, okay, if libido is low, one aspect is not feeling safe. And it might be that you're not actually safe. And it could be that, just because of an argument that happened last week, you're not feeling emotionally safe, and whatever it is. But that really started opening me up too, because my libido took like this crazy tank. And that wasn't the only time in my life that it did, which was, a very unusual thing from a standpoint of just like physical stuff and hormone, perspective. Right. And so that was another, thing I started really exploring, is like, okay, well, what's going on with this? And what are the root causes of why my libido is so low? And a huge thing really was around, that actually feeling safe in, in my environment, and in that situation, both emotionally and physically safe.
Yeah. And it all definitely, men and women, when they feel like they're in a safe environment, everything is heightened and beautiful. And when they're in a non-safe and a threatening environment, or something that's like, the rug's always being pulled out from under them, just steals any and all joy from that circumstance and relationship.
Yeah.
So yeah, you were in a tough place. So now you're going in you are in a tough situation in your own life. You literally get to run over the guy who's hit you, which is awesome. As a dad, again, two thumbs up, two thumbs up. I'm all for it. I personally believe if you break a few arms and legs, there'll be less crime in the world. So that's my personal opinion. But now you're going, you got to get your mind, your heart, your physical health right. Where does your life go from there?
Yeah. So at that point, I am on the right types of substances as far as herbs and lifestyle changes and things to help my body heal. So my protocols for my physical well-being are, working well. And, mental, emotionally, I don't even know how to describe that process in some ways, because I think there was an element of like healing from the trauma. And then I think there was an element of like seeing a pattern and not totally understanding the pattern yet around like, and it's connected to this thing that this other thread, right? Like when we continue to help others, but put in ourselves places where we can't take care of ourselves, we help nobody. And that was, one of the things that like, I think I was really doing that I could not see yet was I was choosing people in my romantic life that I could see their heart and I could see their potential and I could see all these different things. And that, I could almost like see parts of their soul that were just beautiful and I loved. But I just thought that if I said the right things and showed them, there's a different way of doing things. Like, okay, show them like, this is why it's great to have a great job and be responsible. Like, to me, it's like, just obvious, like why would somebody not see that? But really realizing like, like you said, like can't help somebody that doesn't want to get helped. And so, I don't, from a standpoint of healing from that part didn't get healed till later, till I was able to actually start looking and saying, okay, this is the pattern. Why am I doing this? Where is it coming from? Where are my own stories? That sort of thing. And so most of the healing more was around physical and just, meditating and just doing my own breath work and work to really reset my nervous system after something like that. That was really a lot of the work I was doing at that time.
And then now when you're speaking to people and you're talking to them about, working through and getting to the root, like, why do I keep going with abusive men? We'll use that as an example.
Yeah.
What are the tips you'd give to men and women, not just women these days? There's a lot of sick women out there who are gaslighting men. There's a lot of sick men who are gaslighting women. And if you don't know what gaslighting is, not you as a guest doctor, I'm saying to our listeners, gaslighting is when there's something going on in the other person's life and you confront them about it and then they twist it, humiliate you, make you feel like you're an idiot, it's not true, and they take their lie and they make you feel like you're going insane. That's like legit gaslighting. And was it a book or a movie where it was first presented? It was from like the war and the Germans, and there's a lot to it, but basically it's when you try to manipulate people's minds to make them feel insane when you're the liar and the sinner, right? So when you were seeing this now in your life, Dr. Diane, you're seeing patterns going back to abusive guys. Mm-hmm. What did you do to identify the root cause?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I did was finally come to a level of admitting that I had a role in it and not saying that. And there's a very different thing, I think, between that. I try to be very careful when I talk about this because we have to be so careful in like the victim versus responsibility, say landscape of things, where it's like, we can like sometimes like, yeah, like being held against the wall, like fighting for my life, like victim, right? I was a victim in that moment, right? But there's a very different thing between like, okay, I'm a victim in a moment versus I have responsibility for trying to figure out why this is happening over and over again. So I like to be very careful when I talk about this because I want to be careful that I'm speaking in a way that is not, causing any internal like re-traumatization for anybody else's trauma in their life, because there's absolutely times where yes, we are 100%, victims. And there's also times in our life where we are responsible for how we process what has happened to us. And that's really what I'm talking about is like, okay, something bad has happened, something bad continually has happened. Where is my responsibility in helping myself make sure that that doesn't happen again, right? So that's really where the responsibility is. And so in looking at like that question around like, okay, well, what sort of, because a lot of times I think we choose paths and lives when there's a subconscious belief or story or motivation kind of at hand. And, in looking back all the way to these moments, it's, one of the reasons why I wanted to start this conversation like way, an hour or so ago and talk about like, okay, my sister is 0 and I'm 6 and I start becoming this helper in the family role is I actually think for me, when I started looking at this, that it went back to this point of childhood me. Oh, I got so much praise when I was helping. You're such a good helper. And like my parents were, I think, were so busy with everything going on that naturally I got less and less attention. But as I helped, that was a time I could find attention and love. And again, like this is not something I, fault them for at all. I think that's like, that was just a normal, like some of these things that happen to our minds and these stories we make. It's just our young minds trying to make sense of what's happening when we don't have the consciousness or the awareness and the resources to actually understand like, oh, mom and dad are busy trying to survive, raising a household and 4 kids. That's all that was. That wasn't abandonment. That wasn't any of that stuff. That was like, they were very, very loving parents. So none of like, I was very fortunate that way. And at the same time, because there was this connection in my childhood to like, emotions aren't really welcome here. Can't do that very well. And I get love when I help. Love and help became so intimately connected to me that I, on a subconscious level, I really believe that I started choosing to help because that was when I knew I was going to get love. And so, kind of an answer to your question, it's like one of the things that I would really keep, encouraging people to ask is one, or to do is to one, like, where is that place you can find that you are responsible? And which is probably something similar to this of like, why do I keep having the same pattern? What is my, like a good internal question is like, what is my role in why this pattern is? And keep asking why. So it's kind of, sometimes I call stuff like this, sometimes I'll call it like having an internal board meeting where it's like, you get all the different parts of ourselves together, right? The angry part, the part that's sad, the part that's frustrated, the part that's hopeless, that part that is a child. And it's almost like having a conversation with all of these different parts of ourselves internally and saying, okay, well, why am I angry about that? Oh, it's because of this. It's because my, mom left me or something, for example. Okay, well, why am I angry about that? And you keep asking, you keep going, why and why and why and why and if you do that enough times, then we actually begin to get to the roots. And I think it was when I started getting why enough times and I got to the root of like, oh, help and love. So once I could start doing that and realize that these things are not connected, that yes, when we help people, it can be a way of showing love or it can be a way of getting love, but they're not really connected. And so once I started being able to really dissect that was when I started being able to make different choices in my life. And so that's, I think, asking why and continuing to ask why and why and why is what I would really, and finding that place where it's like, you're consciously responsible. And by saying consciously responsible, I mean like, like people are treating you bad and you have trauma and all that, you're not responsible for them. Like allowing yourself to actually feel the part of yourself that has gone through something that is a victim to that trauma and all that. And I think that's important. We don't like, there's this like fine line around like being very careful around like, shaming that part of ourselves that was a victim, but also in these situations, like, okay, well, where is my response? What part of this is like responsible? Am I responsible for healing from this? And I hope I'm saying that in a way where it's, people are hearing this in a way where it's like, okay, I'm not talking about you're responsible for the bad things that have happened to you. What we're saying is like, okay, you're responsible for, changing the stories that are in your head and the beliefs that are in your head that are driving, say, maybe the continuation of these things.
Yeah. How do you break that perpetuating cycle of going to dysfunctional relationship to dysfunctional relationship to abuse to abuse? You got to dig to that why. And I think that's great advice. You just keep pursuing. It doesn't take long. I
Right.
mean, if you're honest with yourself or even get a good godly counselor to help work you through it, it's not a time consuming process, but it is an exhausting process. And it's one you have to be committed to face. I mean, it's not like the reason why people don't do it is because it's emotionally exhausting. But then when you're done, you put a little effort in and you get so much freedom and love and joy.
Right.
Correct? And would you agree?
Oh, 100%. 100%. I really, it's like, when I look back and be like, wow, I really had a pattern of like choosing bad, some of these bad relationships. It's like, that like for some reason is like, it's like a blow to my ego. Like, there's an ego blow that this takes when it's like, we admit some of our failings and that sort of thing. But that's also where the healing comes from.
So where does your life go from there? So you hit the dude with the car, totally rightfully so. No,
Yeah.
he throws himself on the car, and then you move forward. Talk about how do you start getting physically well? Now that
Yes.
we've talked about some of the relational and the moving forward, how do you get physically well?
So that was really just going after the root causes. So it's like getting out of, making sure my home was not moldy was a really big component of it. Going through a wide variety of treatments, including herbs, including various lifestyle things, ozone, sauna, just a ton of different things like that. Looking at my gut health, getting rid of SIBO, getting rid of parasites, cleaning up my thyroid, my adrenals. So it was really just using a lot of the protocols that I use with my clients today of saying, okay, well, this is an adrenal. There's like, got to fix the adrenals, got to fix the thyroid, got to fix the nutrient imbalances. So a lot of that was just going through things and really fixing them, one by one. It's like there was so much going on and my symptoms were so bad that it's like, it almost feels in some ways like, oh, there should be just like this one, like really cool magical treatment. And it really wasn't. It really was just like the combination of the right things of like knowing the right causes and knowing that, okay, there's these dozen plus things that are the root causes and just working through them one by one.
Yeah, and I think that's great advice because how many people do you know that are sick and it's really not one cause, it's multiple causes, and then they get almost overwhelmed and they can't just dig themselves out of the hole. Sometimes it's financially exhausting because you can't do everything at once. Sometimes it's just intellectually your mind shuts down because you're like, okay, I got all this information. Now what do I do with it? So let me ask you this question. With the systems in the body and knowing what you do, is there an order that's typically more beneficial? So for instance, if somebody has like 5 different things, like they got metal toxicity, they got mold, they have adrenal fatigue, they have all these different things that are going on in their body. Obviously, you want to try to eradicate everything at once, but then at the same time, there can be complications for that. So is there a set method of order that you recommend they address these in?
Yeah, generally speaking, so. And, and I really have not found that it works very well to treat everything at once, like 99% of the time. It's almost like when people have chronic illness, it's almost like there's just too much going on at one time to treat everything at once.
Your body just
And
doesn't have the energy.
correct. Yeah, because healing I'm glad you said that because this is what people don't always realize is healing takes energy. And that's actually why I typically go in a certain order. So one of the first things that I really work on for people, oftentimes before we get into the nitty gritty of some of the more complicated disease processes, is what I call the rebuilding phase. And so in the rebuilding phase, we're basically doing exactly that. We're making the body stronger. It's giving nutrients that you're deficient, and it's helping the adrenals, it's helping the thyroid, the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of our cells, that energy producing part of the cell. So it's helping the body become stronger and stronger and stronger so that when we go into killing any infections or detoxing things like molds or metals or other environmental toxins, that the body is strong and resilient. And then, so after rebuilding is actually where I often then do lifestyle changes. And lifestyle changes make sense in many ways to do at the beginning, But oftentimes if people have 0% energy, asking them to change their lifestyle, it's like, well, how am I going to do that? I'm like struggling to get through my day. So the reason why, when we're talking about generally, and this is very general, but
You
this
just
is
drink
how
more coffee. Just drink more coffee.
It's always the answer, right?
That is again sarcasm for our
Yes,
listeners.
yes.
Sorry.
It might have worked out in medical school, but it's not a good long-term strategy.
No,
So
go on. I didn't mean to derail. I'm sorry, people.
It's all good. So rebuilding, lifestyle, and then from there, detoxification from anything that's toxic in the body. And then from there, something that I refer to as microbe balancing, which is killing the bad guys and helping the good microbes to regrow. And I do the microbe balancing last in many cases, not in every case, but in many cases, because when microbes die, when the bad ones die, they will release toxins and your body has to deal with them. And so if you detox the other things that your body could have in it, environmental toxins, metals and molds and all these other things, if you get those things out before you add more in from the killing process, it works better from the body, reacting in a much more positive type of way. So, and again, these are general, and it can depend, but generals are good because generals are a really good starting point to try. And the other thing to, core principles to watch out for that I think are really important, that in general, you always want to like do things to build up at the same time you're breaking down. So like detoxing, killing microbes, that's breaking down. It's asking your body to work really hard. And so you want to give your body things that are energizing, that are restorative at the same time. So always build up as you're breaking down. So that's a general principle. And then listening to your body, like this whole thing of like, these healing crises that, people sometimes have. And like, sometimes those things are a little bit unavoidable, but most of the time, if you're giving herbs, or if you're giving pharmaceuticals and you're negatively reacting to them, it's your body becoming more inflamed. And so as much as possible, if you're feeling like, you're reacting negatively to a treatment, it's really important to say, take a step back and either change the pace or go in a different order to find something that your body's actually going to tolerate in a less inflammatory type of way.
And then what did that journey look like for you? So where did you start and what brought you today? Because I don't want to, again, I keep stepping around these landmines, but I look at the bio you send in, and then I look at your picture, and I look at your website typically, or materials. I don't want to know too much about my guests before they come on the show. That way everything's organic, but I will glimpse over stuff. And when I saw the picture of you that was submitted back in January, I thought you were 10 years like older than me. But now sitting here talking to you live, you look at least 10 years younger than me. So something's happened to you just between that picture and now. It seems to me, not that it was a bad picture, just you look younger and happier and like healthier and more energy just in your face. So I'm curious, where did you go and what was the path you took?
Yeah, I mean, my health recovery actually was, almost a decade ago now. So really it was nothing more than I said, but I'm giggling because of just what this past year has been like stress wise for me. So it's more related to that than like what happened.
Got you.
Health wise to me. So, health wise was really just like, it really wasn't like, I honestly, like, I'd have to go back in my notes to remember exactly what order I did on myself. Like, I don't remember the specific,
roughly,
like
just
all
roughly.
of that. Right. But I got in a mold-free house. I helped my adrenals, my thyroid. I got all the infections like Lyme and Bartonella and worked on all those, worked on parasites and those sorts of things. So, and then I just started feeling better. I did at one point move again. And at that point I moved into a house that did have mold. So I did go through another resurgence and like another crash. But the good thing about understanding the body and going through something like that was I was able to fairly quickly, like at first it was like, what's happening? And then I just remember springing up in bed one morning and being like, I know what this is. There's mold here. And I just left and never went back to that house. Luckily I was renting. So that was easy to get out of. And so, other than that, my health has been really good, but I did just get out of a business partnership, and And that was what was very stressful over the past year. And one of the businesses I own is actually a business coaching business. And this has been it's like the things that we go through, in life are the things that I think we can really help other people with. So I got into business with somebody that other people would say is the wrong person to go into business with. And the reason why is because when I went into the business, it was just like, oh, you like this thing, I like this thing. So we both like the same thing. So like, let's do this, right? So now, it's like now I've done enough in business to know that like, oh, a good business partner, like no matter how wonderful a person is, no matter how much you like the same thing, no matter how well you get along, a good business partner is like have some sort of asset or knowledge or like skill set that complements. That is one that doesn't have, right? It's not like, oh, we like the same things. Wrong reason to go into business with somebody. So basically the stress of the past year, and probably what you're noticing in the picture, was getting out of a business relationship because of a really bad contract. And, it's like nothing bad about this other, individual, anything like that. It was just more around like negotiating out of a contract that was really poorly written because of some mistakes made in the beginning where we didn't talk about that. We were 50-50. There was no provision of what happened if like we had different visions for the corporation, which is what we ended up happening, is different visions for the company, and both wanted to go different directions and nobody was happy. So it was a very stressful year of negotiating out of that and not knowing what was going to happen. So I think that's what you were seeing the stress melt away, because we had finally figured out and negotiated out of that.
Well, good. Get a new picture taken, slap it up there, right?
Right.
All right. Well, listen, Dr. Diane, between your birth and today, is there anything else we missed in your story that's significant before we transition to where are you today and where are you heading? So now that hopefully we can help you get there, since you helped us so much today.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I think is worth saying, and this is just also connected to the libido work, is like in the middle of like getting, well, and all that, I got married and divorced, and
okay, hold on, time out, because we did skip stuff. You mentioned you mentioned the triad, you mentioned the libido work, and then we just kind of skipped. We went from hitting a dude with a car to I was married and divorced, and now I went on vacation. Okay, so back up. Where did this marriage come from? What happened here?
So the marriage was actually with my ex-business partner. And so that was another thing that made the whole thing complicated, right? And so, we fell in love.
I'm not laughing at you, but yes, that is like super difficult thing to do.
Yeah. And it's like, he's a great person. Like it was just one of those scenarios with we really built our relationship around the fact that we liked the same thing as far as medicine. And that was a lot of what even our romantic relationship was built around. And once we started, finding like, oh, there was some problems within the combines of our business, and not being able to sort some of that out. And there was, other things that happened like throughout the relationship that I don't want to go into the details around, but like more the point of is just interrelational conflict that I think made both of us feel unsafe. I think the way I related to him and communicated to him and vice versa, I think it led to a lot of bi-directional unsafety, which is back to the safety and libido thing. And so when, basically when things started getting, more looking at like we were going to separate, and even before that, we had a conversation on like, because at that point, like, we were basically roommates at that point, and still, kind to each other as much as possible, but basically roommates. We had fallen out of love and we were just running our business. And so at this point, we decided that we were going to try polyamory, and because we decided that we wanted to see if that would be a solution to save our marriage in some ways, and that sort of thing. And that was a very interesting thing to explore, because it definitely taught me kind of for the final time that like for me personally, that type of relationship structure is just not a healthy relationship structure for me. But the reason I wanted to mention that was something that I tried was really also related to the work I now do in Libido, because it really, like, going into that world and talking, it led me to a lot of different conversations about a lot of different ways love can work and ways that healthy relationships can work. And some people I did meet were doing it very successfully. Other people I met were doing it very non-successfully. But it really did teach me a lot of different ways about strategies of love, about jealousy, about how to communicate about jealousy, about boundaries, about how to communicate about boundaries, about how to communicate around, like, another person looks beautiful and noticing that a partner sees another person as beautiful, and how to navigate that, and how to navigate novelty and newness, and so many different parts of interrelational dynamics. I really did learn, even though in the end that was not the right relationship for me, I really did learn in the end that it was very, very useful. So that's, so while my my ex-business partner, my ex-husband, why we separated amicably and we wish each other the best and all those great things, there is still this element of anytime separating that many things, especially when there's not a clear way on how to do it, is just extremely stressful. So that's part of what you were, I think, saying, like I said.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And, statistically, forget personal relationships.
Yeah.
Partnerships very rarely work. And
Right.
like you said, when they do work, good contracts make good partners, like good fences make good neighbors, right?
Right. That's
But you
exactly
have
right.
people who complement one another, like where someone may really like the sales end, someone else likes the back end, and they complement each other and they work together well.
Yeah.
But when it gets to the relational things, like, that is totally foreign to me, because every single, you went through like business partnerships with people you're involved with. That's like professional suicide. Then you
Yeah.
went through like a triad and polymorphic and all these relationship types that are like, I'm going to say like what the Bible describes as man and wife, husband, keep it simple and be married and live life together happily. But again, even those today, our world is so polluted and corrupted. They say 50% of marriages end in divorce. So it's like communication and relationships. People have gone out searching because everything's been so polluted and twisted. But man, you went from back to back hard situations and like almost impossible situations to solve. It's like a 50-sided Rubik's Cube, right?
Yeah, it is. It really is. It's a very complicated thing, but it's like I said, it really, like, I went with my original business from, the rice and beans years to taking it to what some stats say is the top 4% of small businesses. Like, I've learned so much from like the rice and bean days to how to get out of like a contract and how to do it in a way that is still like kind and still like thinking about both parties and making sure everybody's okay, but like everybody has their own interests. Like, these are hard things to navigate. So it really did lead me to like more deeply on like the conversation of communication that we keep talking about. That's kind of one of our threads around, like, how do we have these conversations? How do we communicate? How do we do this in a way where we get heard, where we're making sure we're protecting our own interests, but also making sure the other person's like okay too, and taken care of as well.
Yeah. And then before we wrap up into this, what we've already talked about a lot of tips on communication.
Yeah.
And like, especially the segment on your parents and going back to the past and working through it. But when you have a spouse, or when you have a business partner, or a spouse who is a business partner, any final tips on communication that you'd add to that conversation?
Keep the conversation out of the bedroom. I mean, that's like one of very obvious one, like
I don't even want a TV in my bedroom for that reason. No, forget business.
Me neither. Me neither. So yeah, I mean, the biggest, I think the biggest thing is like it becomes, it's almost like where I hear, I don't have children, but like from, my friends that have children, like this conversation that I hear come up around like, okay, we're going to have date night and we're not going to talk about the kids. Right. It's almost in some ways like maybe analogous to that a little bit around like having times where it is like actively choosing not to talk about the business, because when it becomes like their whole day and it's like a connection point, one of the challenges that would come up is like, it'd be 9 o'clock at night and we would just be in conversation, and all of a sudden, like, we're talking about business, and the next thing we know, it's not like talking about business with a friend that's not a vested interest. It's like the next thing I know, we're like trying to solve the business decisions that need to be made. And so just really like I found that it was like really important to have very strong boundaries around like, this is when we are done being business partners, and this is when we are in regular partner, with regular partners. This is when we do vacations, and we're saying, okay, we're vacationing, we're being creative. And sometimes like when we're creative, that's when we solve other business decisions. That's when we have downtime. And so like, okay, where are the boundaries around like where it comes up around like, okay, we can talk about this for, X number of minutes or that sort of thing, which sometimes can feel limiting. But in my experience, to protect the relationship, there has to be those levels of boundaries around when are we business partners, when are we, relationship partners, in order to protect against that.
Yeah. And it's different for everybody, but I do
Yeah,
believe there's
it is.
fundamentals for everybody too.
Yeah.
So, all right. So where is Dr. Diane today, and where are you heading? How can we help you get there?
Yeah, thanks. So right now I have three businesses up and going at this point. And so I have my Lyme doc, and that's very busy. I'm working on hiring some new practitioners for that right now. And I have training programs with that. That's really for people that are in the chronic disease world, that have chronic fatigue or brain fog, fibromyalgia, autoimmune disease, just like these things where it's like, okay, I've had these things for years, and maybe you're on medication, maybe you're not, maybe you're just dealing with it, but you don't really know the roots. So I have, that particular business. And then I have my business over at the Libido Doctor. And that's that business is really just for women. I only work with women in part because we have group conversations, and some of the things that I have found that we talk about, just it makes it a little bit safer for women sometimes to just talk amongst each other. So that's why that one's just exclusively women. And there are some studies that have shown that like libido issues go away when we talk about them. So, it's another reason why having like a safe place to like normalize, like some studies say that there's 70% of people in the world have low libido. Like there's other studies that say 40%, but either way, it's really, really, really high. And people, I think, would never guess this because it's something that's still taboo to talk about. So my work really with that in part is normalizing these hard conversations, helping people feel like they're not alone, helping people feel like they have the support, and then looking at how do we communicate more consciously? How do we keep novelty in, even in the context of monogamy? How do we work with difficult situations? How do we fix hormones? On and on and on. So there's a lot of stuff that we do there. And then my business coaching is called Fem Meets Fortune. And that's a very small part of what I do. It's by application only, but I work with women that are really working to grow their business and to not make some of the mistakes that I did. And, the other thing that I really will say that kind of ties all this together that we started with is this concept of pleasure. And pleasure is a very, very important word to me because I feel like it has been looked at as far as like a human need that is not important. And I say a need in some ways because of what pleasure does. So when we are in a pleasure state and we release oxytocin, a lot of people know as oxytocin as like the love hormone or the connection hormone. But what they don't realize, what people don't realize, is that oxytocin regulates so much of our body. It regulates our cortisol, our stress hormone. It regulates our melatonin, our sleep hormone. It regulates our sex hormones. So when we're talking about this like hormonal dysregulation that I see in Lyme disease, I see with libido, I see when people overwork, I see in all of these areas of my businesses, pleasure is actually one thing that ties all of this together. When we have high oxytocin, we actually are releasing different, the way our brain responds is very, very different. So we actually see, we memorize things better, our memory improves. We solve things from a more creative lens. So it actually changes the landscape through which we are making decisions. So I'm trying to like help people, and a takeaway point is like, get away from this like old hedonic kind of thing around like pleasure is like not not an important thing, right? Or like pleasure is like taking away from like service or other things, and really helping people realize that finding things every day, whether it's embracing a long time in a hug or really sinking into your couch with your dog, like very, very basic things, but allowing yourself to have these moments of the day where you're sinking into pleasure is going to help your brain work better. It's going to help your hormones work better. It's going to lower your inflammation. It's going to help prevent disease. It's going to help your connection, your communication, and so many more things. And I think we get so overwhelmed and so lost in our business and our health problems and all of these types of things that it can be so easy to not prioritize that, when that's a fundamental thing that can actually change so many different areas of your life. And that's, I think, another reason why you see I look different, is because I have gone through my own journey with like, I'm not prioritizing this. I'm not prioritizing pleasure. And like, I'm back to prioritizing pleasure again. And everything in my life works better. I serve people better. I show up better. I can think better. I can work better. All of these things when I allow myself to have pieces of that every day.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying completely. And I think every single person who's been in a stressful situation, bad situation, and then they get out of it and they emerge, they start feeling better. They start, hair grows back when they've been bald for 10 years. They, their energy levels go through the roof. Their sexual libido goes up. Their just outlook changes. Like you said, the perception. So yeah, I don't disregard any of that. I think it's all very, very accurate. So now, if someone wants to get a hold of you, what is the best way for them to reach you? Whether it's talking about libido, Lyme's disease, personal coaching, or business coaching?
Yeah, you can find all my businesses if you go to drdianemueller.com. So that's just kind of the like, you can find, the Lyme stuff on my Lyme doc, the libido stuff on the Libido Doctor, and then the business coaching on Femme Meets Fortune. But if that's all, that's a lot of things that we're talking about. So if you just go to my name, drdianemueller.com, that's where you can find all of my projects there.
And we'll put links in the show notes to all of this. But when you're spelling out Dr. DR or Doctor, the full word?
Dr. DR. So DRDIANEMUELLER.com.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for your time today, Dr. Diane. Between your birth and today, is there anything else we missed or any closing thoughts you want to leave with our community?
Just one more time, pleasure is a gift that will allow your spirit to lift. And thank you for having me today, David.
Oh, it's been fantastic. And it's been very interesting and fun. So I'm very thankful for you. I think I can learn and apply a lot of this, and I think our listeners can too. So I wish you only the best, Dr. Diane.
Same to you.
All right. And ladies and gentlemen, like our slogan says, don't just listen to the great advice Dr. Diane gave. You got to do it. You got to repeat that good stuff each day so you can have a great life in this world, and most importantly, in eternity to come. So this was our friend, Dr. Diane. I'm David Pasqualone. We'll catch you in the next episode. Ciao.
The Remarkable People Podcast. Check it out. The Remarkable People Podcast. Listen, do, repeat. For life. The Remarkable People Podcast.